Good morning, everybody. My name is Robert Pelliciotti. I'm the MCAS Accommodations and Appeals Coordinator. If you're online to this presentation, if you registered, what we're here today to discuss is the MCAS-Alt grade level and competency portfolios. So there's some MCAS-Alt trainings going on currently this week. Some of the trainings are for students that are completing traditional MCAS-Alts, students with significant cognitive impairments. If you're looking for a training for a student that has a significant cognitive impairment, student that's performing significantly below grade level, this would not be the training you are interested in attending or you want to attend. This training is for students that are performing skills at or near grade level or seeking a competency portfolio but have a significant disability and are unable to demonstrate those skills on the test. Just want to clarify that. I will talk about that more during the presentation. Just want to let everyone know the background information so they're in the right place. So again, Robert Pelliciotti, MCAS Appeals and a Competency Coordinator here at the Department of Education. And we're going to discuss a few things today. I thank everyone for taking time out of their day to sign on and appear here for this presentation on grade level and competency portfolios. What are we going to talk about today? Well, we're going to talk about grade level and competency portfolios, what students should be considered for them. We're going to talk a little bit about the requirements for these portfolios. We're going to talk a little bit about how to complete them. We're going to talk about appeals, the appeals process for students with disabilities that are trying to graduate. And then lastly, we're going to have a little Q&A for some questions that I'll answer in the chat. So as I mentioned earlier, first going to talk a little bit about who should be considered for grade level and competency portfolios and what are they for. So unlike traditional MCAS-Alt, which are for students that are significantly below grade level, a student with an intellectual impairment, a student that's in 5th grade, but only completing work at a kindergarten level. These portfolios, grade level or competency portfolios, are for students who have academic skills at or near grade level. So they can perform some of the grade level work when you have defined tasks in a small group. However, these students have a significant disability that prevents them from consistently demonstrating those skills or performing those skills on a testing situation that could be more stressful, like the MCAS test. They have a difficult time switching gears. So this type of portfolio is for what we would call a hard to assess student that'd be difficult to assess. And we want to get some type of authentic or more real score. If the student were to take the standard MCAS test, we know they wouldn't perform well. Perhaps a student would shut down, be very frustrated by switching gears, have a difficult time for completing the test in a single session. So therefore, we want a different way to test these students. This is the grade level and competency portfolio. And if you're looking for information on it and you have these slides, which you should all get when you signed up for this presentation, you can use the links in the bottom of this particular slideshow, this page, and it will take you to the MCAS grade level and competency portfolio manual and the web page that will describe all this information in greater detail. But for the purpose of this presentation, I just want to touch on a variety of themes, give some basic requirements so you understand how to complete it and where to go for resources. So as I mentioned, what type of students should be considered for a grade level or competency portfolio? What are we talking about here? Well, I mentioned earlier that these are students that are performing at or near grade level sometimes in the classroom, but they have a difficult time demonstrating those skills on standardized tests. What do some of these students look like? So perhaps these are students with significant emotional or behavior disabilities. Perhaps they have a significant health-related disability. The student doesn't have the mental stamina to complete a particular test session in a school day. They need several frequent breaks, and the prolonged test administration is too difficult for them to demonstrate their true skills. Perhaps they have a significant motor or communication disability, and then with that motor and communication disability, they can't really articulate their skills on the standard tests. It's not able to get those responses correctly and put them down onto the test format. Those are some of the students that when I think of that could be well suited for a grade level or competency portfolio. Let's talk now about what a grade level portfolio is and what a competency portfolio is. First, in and of itself, when we talk about a portfolio, we're talking about a collection of work samples. So a grade level portfolio is a collection of work samples These are not like an MCAS-Alt in the sense they're not data charts. You don't look at starting a particular skill and demonstrating progress. What you're trying to do is you are assessing students on mini quizzes at all aspects of the required standards. So if a standard was to demonstrate someone's understanding of number sense, understanding of greater than, less than, or equal to, you would basically give the student a grade level quiz and they would complete problems that identify their knowledge of that standard. As I mentioned, we're only looking at work samples, only final work samples. And what would needed to complete these grade level portfolios is use multiple work samples that demonstrate all aspects of the standard. So if there's a specific standard, let's say for reading for literature for grades 3, you would need several work samples that demonstrate the student understands all aspects of the standard. And I'll provide some more detail on that later. Each work sample should have a grade level work description form that describes the student's name, when the student completed the work, and what the student was asked to do. For each subject, there's some specific requirements for grades 3 through 8. If you were to complete one to earn a score partially meeting expectations or higher, the minimum you would need for math is 10 standards. They'd have to document 10 learning standards. For ELA, the minimum would be 3 standards in reading for literature, 3 standards for reading informational text, so that's 6 standards in total, plus 4 writing samples, 4 writing samples. For science, technology, engineering, a student would need a total of 9 standards, 3 in each selected discipline. Again, these are all described in the grade level or competency portfolio manual. I just want to give everyone a little information about what are the basic requirements for completing these portfolios for each subject area. High school competency portfolio. What is it? How is it different? Well, very similar to a grade level competency or grade level portfolio. A high school competency portfolio is a collection of work samples. So in general, it's the same thing. You collect work samples that demonstrate the student's understanding of the standard. How is it different? Well, the term competency implies that a student could earn their CD, their competency determination, by completing one of these portfolios, and hence they could graduate. So we often hear that a student cannot earn a diploma through doing an alternate assessment. So an alternate assessment like the MCAS-Alt, that's the case. They can't earn a diploma because those standards are based on alternate achievement standards, which are lower in complexity than the grade level standards. The competency portfolio is based on high school standards, high school complexity, and students would need to complete work samples based on those high school standards. The difference is they could break these particular standards down to smaller chunks, and they can complete them over the course of year or years, because a competency portfolio is cumulative. What do I mean by that? I mean that it can be submitted and then resubmitted over time. So you submit the portfolio, let's say for math, 15 standards were required. You submit it in grade 10. The student did not receive all the credit. It could be resubmitted with adding additional information. And there's a feedback form that accompanies each portfolio results, describing where the student received credit and areas the student could use need to address to resubmit it again in the future. I want everyone to pay attention to the graduation requirements. The link here on this particular slide, you should have it. So the graduation requirements, as we all know, are changing, and they're different for each class. So just please pay attention to the graduate requirements webpage for students in specific graduating classes, because that would have specific information about which students should do a competency portfolio and in which area. Competency portfolio requirements. So there's some requirements specifically for ELA and math. For English language arts, they're based on the 2017 curriculum frameworks, the same for math. 2017 curriculum frameworks. A student were to submit an English language arts portfolio, competency portfolio in high school, they would need to produce 4 essays plus 2 short responses based on grade level text. What do I mean by grade level text? Well, grade level texts are materials that students would read at the high school level. They would not be based on a student's reading of Charlotte's Web. It'd be based on a high school level piece of literature. The student would not have to read the whole book, but they could read aspects or a chapter of the book and write an essay in response. Perhaps the student read a chapter of The Grapes of Wrath, and the educator asked the student some questions having to do with the characters and describing it, an argument, if you would, about which particular character demonstrated some strength in a particular scene. Again, they don't have to read the whole book, but a chapter, and these essays and responses have to be based on different grade level texts, different. For mathematics, competency portfolio for mathematics, work samples have to demonstrate or document all aspects of 15 standards, 15 from the 5 clustered areas. So it's not an insignificant amount of work, but it's also not something that a student would not be able to achieve over the course of their high school career. This is something the student could start in their freshman year and work on their sophomore year when they submit it. For science, the students who are in grade 9 or 10 would be submitting a portfolio based on 2016 STE frameworks only in biology or physics. Only in biology or physics. These are based on the new curriculum frameworks. There's a total of 8 standards required for biology. 5 are specified that the students have to do, and 3 are at discretion or optional. It means the students and educator can choose among the remaining standards and choose 3 of them. For biology, the same is true. There's a total of 7 standards. 5 are required and 2 are discretionary. Now, why is there different in number between biology and physics? Well, not all standards are created equally. Some standards are more dense and require more work samples. For students who are submitting competency portfolios and submitted them earlier in their high school career, maybe these students are now seniors, but they're resubmitting them. They submit this portfolio earlier. These could be submitted on the legacy frameworks if necessary, and those are based on the 2001, 2006 STE curriculum frameworks. If you have any student that fits that kind of area or fall into that category, please email me and we can discuss it. There's specific requirements for them, and we could talk a little bit about what would be best to work on with those students. If you're going to be working on a grade level or competency portfolio and you're going to submit one, you would submit one to Cognia in the spring, much like an MCAS-Alt that's submitted to the binder. You would want to include a grade level portfolio cover sheet or a competency portfolio cover sheet. The cover sheets are important to identify that it's a competency or grade level portfolio. And examples of these cover sheets are included in the grade level and competency portfolio manual. You will see on these cover sheets, as you can see here on this particular slide, there is a box for ELA, mathematics, and science. Now, why is that? Well, it is possible for a student to do a grade level portfolio in one subject and sit for the test in another subject, or complete an MCAS-Alt in the other subject. Let's say, for example, a student has a significant challenge in English language arts, reading off the computer screen, even a paper test, or responding in that specific area in a MCAS test administration window, and you want to work on a competency portfolio. One could be submitted just in English language arts, and the student could sit for the standard MCAS test in that area. Again, just because they do one competency portfolio in one subject doesn't mean it has to be completed in all subjects. I mentioned earlier that we're going to have some examples. I will describe some examples of a grade level work description and work sample. What do they look like? Each work description has a cover sheet and a work sample. So as you can see on the left-hand side of your screen, you will see a box with the student's name, the date when the work was supposed to be produced, a content area for a student in grade 4. This happened to be a work sample in mathematics. What was the strand or domain? This happened to be grade 4, number and base 10 operations, for NBT2. And what was the learning standard? The learning standard was read and write multi-digit whole numbers using base 10 numerals, number names, and expanded form. Compare 2 multi-digit numbers. So the student compared 2 multi-digit numbers on the right-hand side. So this is one work sample where they compared 2 multi-digit numbers. You will see, though, the learning standard requires a student to read and write multiple digit whole numbers using base 10 numerals, number names, and expanded form. So the student would have to submit more work samples demonstrating all aspects of the standard: expanded form, number names, using base 10 numerals to receive credit for the standard. More work samples, identifying all aspects of the standard. What was the student's overall percent of accuracy of this assignment? So each assignment has to be scored. The student received 100%. And what was the independence? What does that mean? Well, was the student coached in any way? So the student received 100% independence because they did not receive any coaching. Coaching could be prompts or cues to remind the student to focus, take time, recheck their work, use a reference sheet. Those would be prompting and cues that would affect the level of independence. They could be provided, and those would be acceptable prompts. And if you're provided those prompts or cues, you give the student like an 80 or 90% level of independence. Accommodations can be provided, such as reading aloud, providing a calculator, typing the student's answers, a scribe, but those do not affect the level of independence. Here's an example of a competency portfolio. Much like the grade level portfolio, you'll see a work description on the left-hand side, the actual work on the right-hand side. The work description has to include the student's name, when the work was produced, the standard that was addressed, was there any accommodations, a calculator, and so forth. And then you see the work on the side. It's really important that these are accurately scored so we understand the student, what credit the student got, or student's level of accuracy on assignment. I mentioned earlier that each competency portfolio would come with a feedback form. This is a feedback form for a competency portfolio, providing specific and detailed information how the student did and demonstrate their understanding of the standard. You would read these comments to determine whether the portfolio would need to be resubmitted and what aspects would need to be resubmitted. Now, there's a lot of information on here. For the nature of our presentation, I will just describe a few aspects to help guide everyone that's attending. So if we look at this feedback form, let's look over at the first line in the middle of the page under conceptual category. On the left-hand side, you'll see a box that says number and quantity. Student has to demonstrate their knowledge of number and quantity standards. They have to address all aspects of N, R, and A. The reviewer that's reviewing these is determining whether this is a grade level 10 complexity. The reviewer said no, the work is not a grade level 10 complexity. Was the work accurate and complete? The reviewer indicated it was not accurate and complete, so more needed to be submitted. Was the work at independence 75% or higher? Yes. So all the work was completed at 75% or higher. Student, yes. But the evidence for this category is N. So it's insufficient, more evidence is needed. So what would be needed? The order of operation problems were below grade level. And there was no examples of exponents. So again, the work we submitted, they'd have to submit order of operations at a high school level, making sure they're including high school level problems and exponents, if that makes sense. Again, specific feedback that they could use to resubmit this portfolio to gain credit. Move on to the next slide. We'll talk a little about collecting portfolios remotely. Now, the reason why I have this is that probably we would hope virtually all your students are in school, back in school. However, we know that we work with a variety of students with a variety of needs. Some may still not be working in school. Some still may be in a virtual base. It is a virtual education situation where educators are working with them. It is possible to complete a portfolio work samples for a student working remotely as long as it's done during synchronous class time. This slide describes specific examples of what would need to be done to document that, what would need to be included on the work description label. Again, this is just reference. I know you can read it. Just everyone should know that it is possible to work with a student that's receiving educational services at home or hospital or not in the school building to complete one of these type of portfolios. It's possible. How are these portfolios scored? What are the content expert reviewers looking for? What are they reviewing for? So they're looking for basic components, basic areas, basic criteria, I should say. One, they're looking for are all the required strands and standards submitted. So the requirements page, are they including the 15 standards for math? If they're not, it's not going to receive the passing or partially meeting expectation score. Does the work address all aspects of the standard? If the standard requires a student to demonstrate their understanding of multiplication, division, and subtraction, and they only have work samples on multiplication, division, but not subtraction, they're not demonstrating all aspects of the standard. Is the work at grade level complexity? So for example, as I mentioned earlier, if a student was completing a English language arts competency portfolio with essays, and their essays are based on text, as they have to be, was the text Charlotte's Web or was it a grade level text? Was the students writing at the high school level? So they look at those particular aspects. Are the students' responses accurate? Is it produced independently? What does independence mean? 75% or above. So think of acceptable supports that could be provided that would affect the level of independence. Educator who's asking a student to do this can redirect the student's attention. They can remind students to show all work. They can tell the student to recheck work. They can instruct the student to use a reference sheet or organizer. Those types of prompts could be used. However, it would be unacceptable to provide modeling, showing sample problems on top of board, providing step-by-step supports, suggesting the correct answer. If those prompts are provided, the level of independence would be below 75%. It would be below, and therefore the student would not receive credit for those work samples. It's important to know that we are not in your classroom during this time. So often the answer alone isn't enough. We need to understand, the content experts need to understand what the student did to get to the answer. So it's important to show work when necessary, when provided these. For students that are in high school, they're completing competency portfolios, one would imagine, or they could to earn their competency determination, but there are also other options. There are options through the MCAS performance appeal process to earn their CD. Students who've taken courses in the regular classroom area could submit perhaps a cohort appeal, or they could also submit a portfolio appeal, which is similar to a competency portfolio. It just has a different eligibility requirement, meaning the material, the work samples can be submitted multiple times a year. Typically, it's for a student who is a senior and looking for more opportunities to submit a portfolio with receiving feedback. I mention these because these are options for students in high school to earn their CD. We want to provide alternate pathways for students to get their CD and achieve a high school diploma. Please know that we have a new MCAS appeals application. It used to be a paper-based application for cohort and portfolio appeals. Now these appeals are online. This is a reference slide for people. I'm not going to describe all aspects of this, just to make sure everyone's aware of that. Appeals can be submitted for students in high school to the MCAS performance appeal process, and these are submitted online, and students have to meet a certain eligibility requirement to submit these type of appeals. I'd certainly be willing to talk with you more about this. There's a step-by-step guide here in this link on this particular web page for the appeal. And if you look back over here on this, later on the slide, I'll tell you how to get to actually the MCAS appeals website. So one piece of information I want to provide is an update on the required passing score. We know there's interim range and appeal range. Sometimes there's been a question about students receiving a score of not a partially meeting expectation, but a score below that, can they still receive their CD? Well, if a student scores in the 455 or above in the ELA next generation test, that's equivalent to 220, they would achieve a passing score. The scores are listed here. There is what we call an MCAS appeals range for a cohort appeal, and the comparable ranges are listed here between the next generation MCAS test and the legacy tests. The magic score used to be 220 to 221, or I should say 220 to 228 for the cohort appeals. It is now different depending on each subject area. So it's different depending on each subject area. That's why I want to provide this information here. So for example, the equivalent of the next gen score range for cohort appeal in biology is 467 to 477. That's equivalent to the 220 to 228 range. Again, this is a reference slide for everyone, just so you know that the appeal ranges have been updated and changed from the legacy MCAS test to the next generation MCAS test. If you were to complete one of these or thinking about completing one of these with a student in your school, what would be the first step? What kind of processes would educator, guidance counselor, someone in their school, administrator, think about would be necessary to take to complete one of these portfolios. First, they should really determine the students for whom a competency portfolio appeal would be appropriate. So for what students it would be appropriate. So identifying the students that could potentially be well suited for it. As I mentioned before, a student that has some academic skills that are at or near grade level, but for a variety of reasons related to their disability, they just can't demonstrate those skills. Then the individual working with the student would talk with the principal and other adults familiar with the student and decide through an IEP meeting if this was the right course. Is there buy-in? Is there support? Does the IEP team, this is the best way for the student to participate in MCAS? This is the best way for a student to potentially graduate if the student's in high school. And then they would review the requirements, what are the submission requirements, by reviewing the grade level or competency portfolio manual. Collaboration is very important. Why is collaboration important? Because in a school, being an island is not often make us successful. If you're a special educator, oftentimes you're very adept at working with your students and modifying work, but perhaps you're not a curriculum coordinator in the biology department. So you would need to work with a biology curriculum coordinator, general education teacher to help design some work samples and quizzes that demonstrate all aspects of a specific standard. Make sure you review the grade level and competency portfolio webpage and manual and the curriculum frameworks. And then beware of the submission dates. These portfolios, if you're completing them this year, I believe they're due either April 1st or the last day of March. Kevin will provide those dates for me later on in the presentation, but they're due early spring before the end of the school year. And we have workshops where if someone's working on these, a portfolio feedback workshop that you could attend and receive feedback throughout the school year. Resources for preparing portfolios. As I mentioned earlier, you want to talk with your staff in your school and district. I have excerpts on our websites. You want to make sure that you look at these excerpts. You want to make sure you attend portfolios and progress sessions. We have feedback forms. If you're doing a competency portfolio, one was submitted earlier, you can look at those previous feedback forms. There's also our grade level and competency portfolio webpage, as well as our MCAS appeals webpage. I mentioned earlier, if you have questions about the cohort or appeals website, or how to submit a cohort appeal, what's the appeal range. You can use this link to take you to the MCAS Performance Appeals website. It is 10 o'clock. We went through this in about a half an hour, which is nice, so I can have time for questions for everybody. I wanted to give everyone a gallop through the nuts and bolts of the grade level and competency portfolio, so the basic requirements. I don't expect everyone to remember all of the material, all of the information from this presentation, but I wanted to provide a basic understanding of what this type of portfolio is, how to begin completing one of them, and what are some students that would be well suited for these portfolios. So let me look in the Q&A here and see if there's any questions. Nadia asked a question: does every piece of writing for the ELA binder need to be based on different texts? Yes, in the sense that if there is a ELA binder for competency and there are 4 essays and 2 short responses, they should be based on 6 texts. 1 essay based on each text, and the text doesn't have to be a whole book. It could just be a paragraph or a news article, but it has to be something at the high school level complexity. I see another question. Thank you for the question, Lauren. You asked, out of the amount of competency-based portfolios that are submitted, how many of them actually receive their diploma after completing it? Very good question, Lauren. So I would say roughly between 30 and 50% of students will receive credit for their competency portfolio at any given time. Oftentimes, a student that can achieve some of the standards would need to resubmit it. So when we review these, let's say we had 15 that was submitted last spring, maybe 5 of those received, were passing, but the feedback is provided so they can be resubmitted later on. So oftentimes what happens is that they're not receiving a full score, or because the portfolio is incomplete the first time, but when students work on them continuously, they are able to achieve that standard. So anywhere between 30 and 50% on the first submission, and then later on, it's much higher, between 70 and 80%. Jody and Lauren, another couple people asked, is the March the only date to submit? Do seniors get some time earlier? So Jody and Laureen and Brendan. So if you're submitting a competency portfolio in place of the MCAS test, it must be submitted in March. If you're doing a portfolio appeal for student high school and the student is eligible, it can be submitted multiple times during the school year. And email me and I can provide you information on that. It has to, and you would also want to look at the MCAS appeals web pages for that information. They'll give you the submission dates. Rebecca, can I use the writing rubric posted on the Alt web page for grading the high school CD portfolio? I would not. Rebecca, what I would do is I would use the rubrics or the annotated released items from the standard MCAS test. So if you go to a MCAS Pearson Support and you look for paper-based tests in ELA for the particular grade level, you could see writing examples and how they are scored. 1, 2, 3, 4. I think 1, 2, 3, 4, or 5. And based on those, you could compare the writing sample of the student meeting those criteria. Let me know if you have questions on that or where to find those. I could certainly connect you to that level. You may also want to talk with your ELA grade level teacher about that. And Green, thank you for the question. I have 2 students who took on-demand testing with accommodations and passed multiple subjects. Awesome. There are some areas that they need an EEP. Is the competency portfolio needed in order to fulfill the EPP requirement? No. An EPP is a local requirement, and so if a student passed, meaning they passed in terms of the state, the EPP is local, and then there's an EPP test for math that could be done, but generally EPP means tutoring and continuous support in that area, and you would want to talk with your guidance counselor or district person on what students do to fulfill the EPP requirement. Melissa, for the competency math portfolio, do we need to submit a cover sheet for each standard or a cover sheet for every worksheet that is connected to the standard? A cover sheet for, you need to submit a cover worksheet for every submission. So for example, in the example I showed you here, let me go back. You can see this particular one right here. There's a work description cover sheet, and then there's the work sample. Each work sample like this needs a cover sheet. If you do a long quiz, make sure that it's based on one standard, not based on different standards. Ed, how are you doing today, Ed? I hope everything is going okay. When is the first time an appeals portfolio can be submitted, and how many times each school year can they be resubmitted after feedback? So appeals portfolio is based on someone's eligibility. For math or for ELA, a student would have to participate in the MCAS test 3 times before they're eligible for an appeal, or they could do a competency portfolio twice. So typically it's not till a student would be a senior, and they could be submitted 3 times a year. 1 in end of October, 1 in March or April, and 1 in June. Rebecca, can we also submit CD portfolios on November 4th? We were told that was one of the deadlines. Rebecca, I'm sorry this is somewhat confusing. And trust me, it is okay, because this is somewhat complicated because the terminology is very close. You have competency portfolio appeal. Competency portfolio is submitted in lieu of the MCAS test, submitted to Cognia, just like an MCAS-Alt. Portfolio appeal is for students that are eligible for a portfolio appeal, meaning they've submitted the test, or they've taken the test a couple times, or they submitted a competency portfolio before and they're a senior. Then they can submit it to the department using the security portal according to those guidelines, those deadlines 3 times a year, November 4th, March, and June. I hope that provides you the correct information. Let me know if it doesn't. I'll certainly be more willing to talk with you after. I know it is, I wish it was super straightforward, but the nature of our assessment system is we want to have a variety of options for students. So with sometimes options come complexity. What kind of work samples are best for a high school biology portfolio? Well, work samples are best are work samples where the student could demonstrate their knowledge and skills and someone understands what they're doing. You could potentially do a lab report depending on the particular standard. It could be a quiz where just ask students questions like they do in the classroom. What is not appropriate to do is to do like a worksheet where a student has the answers embedded in the worksheet and they're just pulling the information and plugging it. So I would stick with lab report, project, quizzes, mini assignments, anything that you would do in the classroom to determine the student understands it. You could do an oral exam if you wanted to record yourself based on the standard. That could also be done. But the intent is that students who are submitting these are demonstrating their knowledge and skills, and we have an understanding how the student got to their answer and what the standard was. Tiara, is there an alternate to the portfolio? What if a student is incapable of completing the portfolio? Good question. So the portfolio is the alternate to taking the test. First is the test. The student doesn't have skills to do that. Then they could do the alternate MCAS-Alt based on alternate achievement standards. Those are students that are significantly below grade level. Or they do this competency portfolio. Those are the options. If you're thinking there's another way, certainly let me know, but those are the alternate options we have. For the math, Khadijah asked, for the math high school, would one cover letter be enough for each cluster? Cover letter. No, because if you look at this, well, let's say, for example, cluster for math, right? Cluster is number and quantity. You would need a quiz demonstrating nRNA, but you would not be able to do nRNA, nRNA-B, NQA with one particular worksheet. I mean, you could certainly try, but typically that would be very difficult for a student. But you definitely could not do number and quantity and algebra under the same work description or same quiz. I hope that's helpful. Jane, when you resubmit, do you resubmit the entire competency portfolio? Yes. You submit what you receive back with the new material in front. Thank you for the good question, Jane. Suzanne, can you assess more than one standard at a time in math? I think I just answered that. Yes and no, Suzanne. I would not try. I would just do number quantity one through one quiz, mini quiz, because you're going to have at least 12 to 15 problems for each quiz. I wouldn't want to do a unit quiz where you do more than that. It's also very difficult to score. Also, in the portfolio requirements posted on DESE, it does not state that every aspect of every cluster needs to have an assessment. For example, algebra, 4 examples for 4 aspects of the 5 clusters. Yeah, so you can choose. I think I understand your question, Suzanne, but you can call me afterwards and we can talk a little about it. Tiara, when is the deadline to apply for student for the portfolio? It must be submitted by the due dates, Tiara. So there's 2 things. For portfolio appeal, there's a submission due dates that are available on the MCAS Performance Appeals website. For these competency portfolios, in lieu of the MCAS test, it just has to be submitted in March, end of March, to Cognia, like students who are taking the regular MCAS-Alt. Ed, for the math work sample using order of operation, is it acceptable to provide partial credit for the work, even if the final answer is incorrect? Ed, you can score it how you think the student did. But there has to be sufficient evidence the student understands knowledge of the particular standard. So if you have several examples and all several examples got partial credit, probably wouldn't be good. But if one was partial credit, the other one was full credit, it could be accepted. Rebecca, what graphic organizers can be provided during the writing process for ELA high school CD portfolio? Are only the ones provided during typical MCAS? And can there be more than one graphic organizer provided throughout the process? Yeah, go right ahead. You can provide more graphic organizers, they're fine. The most important thing about the graphic organizers is they're not like a Mad Lib or a sentence frame. There's no sentence starters. They're organizing to help the student organize their thoughts and ideas, but they're not providing transitional words like first reason the student did X and then the student fills it in. That would not be appropriate graphic organizer. Khadijah, can we submit 2 clusters by November and then continue, or does it have to be all completed? It depends what you're talking about. You could submit for a portfolio appeal, partial portfolio appeal, and you get feedback. It just wouldn't pass, so I guess that's acceptable. Tiara, how would you submit an oral work sample? Good question. You would submit a video file. For example, if you recorded a student providing a response in an oral presentation, you would submit that video file. Perhaps it would be a DVD. The reason why I've mentioned that, because we have gotten DVDs or and also flash drives before of students submitting or describing their answers. Emily, for the ELA competency portfolio, are we submitting 2 drafts, 1 final for each writing piece? Yes, typically you need to have a draft and a final where the student does their own edits. Rebecca, can you repeat what you just said about everything, resubmitting everything, even things that have already received passing scores? So if you're submitting a competency portfolio or portfolio appeal and you're resubmitting it because the student it was submitted previously, you submit all the previous work that you received with the feedback form and submit all the new material in the same binder in front of it. For the ELA portfolio, is a paragraph long enough for the short responses? Katie, that's a good question. You know, you really have to use your discretion on what that means. Typically, it's 2 paragraphs for short responses, but is 1 paragraph long enough? What do you think at a high school level would be sufficient? So in part, you have to use your discretion based on your understanding of high school level work as something to pass the MCAS test. So any student can submit the portfolio, Tiara asked. Any student that's eligible can submit a portfolio. They have to be eligible. Different eligibility requirements for a competency portfolio and a portfolio appeal. What is the final date for a student to qualify for one during the year? Again, they just have to be eligible. There is no final date. They just have to be submitted. Competency portfolios to be submitted by the end of March. Is this something that is done most often in high school, or do students in elementary, middle school also participate in this? I would say in general, more students in high school do submit competency portfolios. We do receive a few grade level portfolios for students, just simply because the standard MCAS test is not appropriate for them. And we want to get a more authentic measure. Katie at the bottom said, for the ELA competency portfolio, do you recommend teachers include rubric scores? No, just include your score, Katie. We'll score it. If you want to include the rubric score, you can, but it's not required. For a short list response, Emily asks, can the student write about 2 different texts if it's 2 paragraphs? Sure, you just have to do at least 1 for each response, at least 1 different text. The point is you can't read 1 book. So like I'm going back to the Grapes of Wrath, or let's say a high school biology. Let's get high school, like a biography in high school, and write 5 essays about the biography. Tiara asked a question, where can we find the requirements and eligibility for the portfolio in MCAS-Alt? So portfolio appeals for students in high school or cohort appeal requires a student to be eligible, meaning they have taken the MCAS test prior in high school. For a competency portfolio or grade level portfolio like an MCAS-Alt, the student has to be a student with a disability. You're submitting it in place of the MCAS test. If a student is picked up on an IEP January 1st, will we still be responsible for the entire portfolio by March 31st? Well, so responsible is maybe kind of a strong term, meaning that if this is what you want the student to graduate, they have to submit all the work. So there's obviously, you could submit what you have, but the student's not going to graduate. They have to submit all the material to demonstrate their knowledge. So you can submit it in this year, then resubmit it the following year. Crystal asked, if you have a student who can perform 1 MCAS, but not the other 2 based on a learning level disability, can they submit an MCAS portfolio 1 subject and sit for the test on others? Yes, Crystal, they totally can. I tried to emphasize that earlier when I talked about this in the slide and if you did in the cover sheet. You see here, there's a cover sheet, grade level portfolio cover sheet, and competency portfolio cover sheet. There's a subject for each area. So you could do a grade level ELA, and they can also take a math, the standard MCAS math test. But you are correct. It is possible. And I really appreciate that question for anyone who missed that earlier. How many questions did I get? 30? It's a good number of questions. I actually wish I could see everybody because I really feel I like the face-to-face, so I kind of can see the reactions of your faces when I'm answering the question, or I can do some comprehension checks because you're all educators, and I would imagine you understand, like if you're trying to explain something to people, you want to be able to gauge whether they understand what you're saying and grasp the material. Also, I think it'd be more fun for me. I hope this is the last of my virtual trainings. I hope we can maybe do some face-to-face trainings in the spring. I know these are convenient. We don't have to travel, whatnot, but I would be remiss if I didn't mention that I really appreciate the work that everyone's doing out there. I really thank you for attending this. I believe it's a really good option for some students. For some students, it's a really good option who are difficult to assess. And we want to help students specifically graduate. We want to help students get those skills. We don't want them to just take the MCAS-Alt if they have some added grade level skills. And we also don't want them to be disenchanted with the MCAS test in general. If we know they take the standard test and they just don't perform well. We want to give them an option. We want to explain to them that they can do this. We want to give them confidence. This is we don't want to create some kind of external locus of control. We want to create some internal locus. We want to say, hey, we believe you can do it. Here's an alternate pathway. Here's the information. Let's build on those strengths. That's what I truly believe. And that's why I think this is a good option. I'm not just trying to say that just to say it. I really do mean it and believe it. And I really thank you for the work you're doing out there. I know it's not easy, especially during these times of, being virtual learning, going back to the classroom. I worked in a school for several years, and I know that out of the 1,000 things that are going on in a particular day, sometimes MCAS doesn't always take priority. And there's other challenges everyone deals with. But I want to let you know that I will certainly be here to support you with any questions you have and provide you information you need, because I know that there's a lot of things going on. So if you have any questions, my contact is here later on this presentation. Let me move this slide over. 1 second here in the back. Robert Pellicciati, there's my email address. You could email me with any questions. Hopefully I have a topic I know about. I know a little about cars, not that much. So I can tell you where to go if you need a good mechanic. Other than that, I appreciate everyone's time. Have a great rest of your morning and take care. Have a good school year.